Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you are from and what time you are watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories like this one. Now, let's begin. The drive out to Black Ridge took us 6 hours from Denver, and honestly, if it wasn't for my buddy Jake's obsession with abandoned places, I never would have made that trip. I was 24 then. Fresh out of college with a journalism degree I wasn't using. Bartending nights at this dive place downtown while figuring out what to do with my life. Jake worked construction. Had this whole YouTube channel about urban exploration that was starting to get some traction. Maybe 8,000 subscribers or something like that. He'd been researching Black Ridge for months. Found it buried in some Colorado Historical Society archives. This mining town that went from boom to bust practically overnight in 1978. The official story was that a series of cave-ins made the mines too dangerous. Insurance companies pulled out, and without the copper mine, the town just dried up. But Jake had found these old newspaper clippings from nearby towns. Little mentions here and there about families leaving in the middle of the night. About the mining company buying up all the local properties for way more than they were worth. We got there around 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday in October. The kind of crisp fall day where the air feels sharp in your lungs. Black Ridge sat in this valley between two mountains, and you had to take this dirt road that switched back and forth down the mountainside to reach it. The town itself was smaller than I expected, maybe 40 buildings total. Most of them these single-story wooden structures with their roofs caving in. Main Street was just this wide dirt road with storefronts on either side. Their windows either broken or boarded up with plywood that had warped and split from decades of weather. What got me right away was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but this heavy, pressing silence, like the mountains were holding their breath. Jake parked his truck near what used to be a general store, its faded sign still readable. Morrison's Goods and Supplies. We grabbed our backpacks with water, flashlights, and Jake's camera equipment and started walking through town. Our footsteps unnaturally loud on the packed dirt. The first weird thing we noticed was the church at the end of Main Street. Every other building had broken windows, doors hanging off hinges, roofs collapsed. But this church was intact, not maintained. Exactly, white paint was peeling, and the wooden steps were rotting, but the windows were whole, the door was shut. And there was even this brass doorknob that hadn't tarnished completely. Jake wanted to film there first. Said it would make great roll footage. But when we got closer, we saw fresh tire tracks in the dirt. Maybe a day or two old at most. That should have been our first real warning, but Jake was excited. Talking about how maybe there were other urban explorers here recently. How we might find their tags or signatures inside somewhere. We tried the church door, but it was locked. Not with some old rusty lick either, but this heavy-duty master lock that couldn't have been more than a year old. The windows were covered from the inside with what looked like black fabric. And when Jake tried to peek through a gap near the window frame, he pulled back and said it smelled wrong in there. Like chemicals. Like the cleaning supplies his dad used to use at the funeral home he managed. We decided to check out the mining company office instead. This two-story brick building near the edge of town with Ridgeline Copper Corporation carved into a stone block above the entrance. The front door was gone completely, just an empty frame leading into darkness, and Jake went in first with his camera light in. Me following with my phone flashlight. The first floor was what you'd expect, desks overturned, papers scattered everywhere. Old filing cabinets with their drawers pulled out and emptied. But Jake found this one filing cabinet in a back room that was different, locked with another new lock just like the church. He had bolt cutters in his truck for situations like this, said it was standard gear for urban exploration. And after 15 minutes of going back and forth about whether we should cut it. Curiosity 1, Inside were dozens of manila folders, and when we started reading through them, that's when everything changed. These weren't mining records, they were payment ledgers. Checks written out to families in Black Ridge. All dated from September and October of 1978, all for amounts between $30,000 and $50,000, which was serious money back then. Each folder had a family name, and inside were these agreements, all with similar language about compensation for relocation and confidentiality regarding mining operations. But the disturbing part was the handwritten notes paper, clipped to some of them, things like, husband refused initial offer. See Incident Report 7B, or family relocated after consultation with security team. Jake was filming everything. Getting close, ups of the documents, when we found this thicker folder at the back labeled Tunnel 4 Incident, Confidential. Inside were photographs, black and white, showing a collapsed mine entrance. But if you looked carefully at one of them, you could see what looked like a torn piece of flannel shirt sticking out from under the rocks. There were medical examiner reports talking about 11 miners who were in Tunnel 4 when it collapsed. But then, there was this memo from the company executives saying they'd only reported 7 deaths to the authorities. The other 4 were listed as resolved internally, with payments to their families totaling to $100,000. Jake's face went pale reading that, and he kept saying we had to get copies of everything, that this was huge, that people needed to know what really happened here. That's when we heard the truck engine outside. This low diesel rumble that cut through the silence like a knife. We both went to the window, staying low, and saw this old Ford F-250, rust, eaten around the wheel wells, parking right behind Jake's truck. 2 men got out, both probably in their 60s, wearing these identical brown Carhartt jackets and baseball caps. The bigger one, built like a linebacker gone to seed, had this shotgun that he kept casual, broken over his arm like he was going bird hunting. The smaller one, thin with a gray beard down to his chest, was carrying what looked like a gas can. They stood there for a moment looking at Jake's truck. Then the bigger one said something and pointed at the mining office where we were hiding. Jake grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. Whispered that we needed to get out the back. But when we crept to the rear of the building, we saw another truck parked there, blocking the back exit, engine running but nobody inside it. We could hear footsteps on the front porch now, slow and deliberate. And that thin guy's voice carried through the broken windows. "We know you are in there. Just want to talk about what you are doing with private property." Jake had his phone out, trying to get a signal. But we were too deep in the valley. No bars at all. The footsteps came into the building, and we could hear them moving through the front room, not rushing, just walking normal like they had all the time in the world. The bigger guy was talking now, his voice carrying this weird conversational tone. "My grandfather worked Tunnel 4. Made good money for the family before the accident. Real shame when outsiders come stirring up old grief. You understand?" We were crouched behind a row of filing cabinets in the back office, and I could feel sweat running down my back, even though it was cold. Jake had turned his camera off, was clutching it like a weapon, and I remember thinking how stupid we were, how we should have told someone where we were going. Should have seen the red flags. The thin man's voice came from closer now, maybe the next room. "Found their backpacks here, Carl. Couple of water bottles, energy bars. City kids, looks like." Carl laughed, but there was nothing funny in it. Just this hollow sound that made my teeth hurt. Then Jake did something I'll never forget. He stood up, walked right out into the open with his hands visible, and started talking in this calm, steady voice I'd never heard him use before. "Hey guys, we're just here taking photos for a college project. Documenting ghost towns in Colorado. We didn't mean to trespass, didn't know this was private property. We'll leave right now. No problems." Carl and the thin man were standing maybe 10 feet away and up close. I could see Carl's eyes were this washed out blue, like sky through dirty glass, and he had these thick scars across his knuckles. The thin man's face was all sharp angles, cheekbones that looked like they could cut paper. And he was smiling, but only with his mouth, not his eyes. Carl shifted the shotgun, still not pointing it at us but making sure we saw it, and said, "College project, huh? Then you won't mind showing us what you've been filming. Hand over the camera, son." Jake hesitated for maybe 2 seconds, then passed his camera over. Carl gave it to the thin man, who started scrolling through the footage, his face getting darker with each second. They were in the filing room, Carl. They saw the tunnel for papers. Carl's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. Like a dog getting ready to bite. The thin man pulled out the camera's memory card and put it in his pocket, then dropped the camera on the floor and stomped on it. The crunch of plastic and glass echoed in the empty room. Jake flinched but didn't move otherwise, and I was still half hidden behind the filing cabinets, trying to control my breathing. Carl started talking again, his voice lower now. "You boys need to understand something. This town, these buildings, they're not abandoned. They're protected. My family, the Brennans, the Washburns. We all stayed close after Black Ridge closed. We made promises to people. Signed papers just like the ones you were snooping through. The mining company paid good money for our silence. And that money put our kids through school, bought our houses, kept our families fed for 2 generations." He took a step closer to Jake, and I could smell him now. Cigarettes and motor oil and something sour underneath. But more than that, we gave our word. My grandfather, the thin man's father here, they died keeping that word. And we're not about to let some YouTube kids with cameras destroy what they built. The thin man walked over to where I was crouching and grabbed my shoulder, pulled me up with surprising strength for someone so skinny. His fingers dug into my shoulder blade, and he steered me over to stand next to Jake. "Here is what's going to happen," Carl said. And now he was holding the shotgun with both hands, still not quite pointing it at us but close enough. "You are going to get in your truck and drive out of here. You are going to forget you ever heard of Black Ridge. You are going to delete any copies of anything you might have uploaded or backed up. If we see you again, if we hear you've been talking about this place, well, mining towns are dangerous. Old tunnels collapse all the time. Sometimes people fall in and never get found." The thin man let go of my shoulder and walked to the window, looked out at the street. "Their truck's not the only vehicle here, Carl. Saw fresh tracks by the church, too. We might have more visitors." Carl's face went tight, and he grabbed Jake by the front of his jacket, pulled him close enough that their faces were inches apart. "You bring friends? How many people know you are here?" Jake shook his head, said it was justice, swore on his mother's life. But Carl didn't look convinced. That's when we heard it, a woman's voice calling out from somewhere near the church. Young and clear. "Hello? Is someone there?" My car broke down on the mountain road, and I saw the trucks down here. Carl and the thin man exchanged this look, and without a word, the thin man headed for the door, moving faster than I'd seen him move before. Carl kept his attention on us, but I could see him thinking, calculating something behind those faded eyes. "Looks like this is your lucky day, boys," he said finally. "We've got a more pressing problem now. But here is the deal. You are going to walk with me to your truck, nice and calm. And you are going to drive out of here. The thin man's going to follow you to the county line. Make sure you keep going. And if your phones somehow start working on the way out, you forget our faces, forget our names. Forget everything except that Black Ridge is a dangerous place where people get hurt." He marched us outside, the shotgun now definitely pointed in our direction, and I could see the thin man talking to a young woman near the church. Maybe mid-20s, wearing hiking gear. She looked confused but not scared yet, and the thin man was gesturing toward her car, probably offering to help. Carl stood next to Jake Struck while we got in, then leaned into Jake's window and grabbed his wallet from his pocket before Jake could react. He pulled out Jake's driver's license, held it up so we could both see it, then put it in his own pocket. Nathan Garfield, 1847, Colfax Avenue, Innu, Denver, he read out loud. I'll keep this as insurance. You stay quiet. You'll get it mailed back in a month. You talk. Well, I know where you live now, don't I? He stepped back, gestured for us to leave, and Jake started the truck with shaking fingers as we drove down Main Street. I looked back and saw the thin man leading the woman toward the mining office, his hand on her elbow, Carl following behind them. The woman was looking around now, and something in her body language had changed, like she'd realized something was wrong. Jake drove faster, taking the switchbacks up the mountain so fast I thought we'd go over the edge. Neither of us spoke until we hit the highway, and then Jake pulled over and threw upon the side of the road. We never talked about reporting it. What would we say? That we'd broken into private property and found old documents that some locals threatened us. Jake got his license back exactly 1 month later, no return address, and we never spoke about Black Ridge again. But sometimes I Google it and here is nothing. No stories about missing hikers, no news about that woman. Maybe she was one of them, maybe her car really did break down, or maybe here is another folder in that filing cabinet now. Another incident that was resolved internally. The call about Uncle Howard's estate came on a Thursday afternoon in early September. I was 32-pagey living paycheck to paycheck, fixing computers in a cramped shop in Philadelphia, when the lawyer told me I'd inherited everything. Howard Bowman wasn't exactly close family. He was my mother's older brother who'd cut ties with everyone about 15 years ago after some argument nobody talked about. Mom passed 5 years back, so when the lawyer mentioned Howard had no other living relatives, I became the default beneficiary. The Victorian house sat in Stillwater, a town of maybe 800 people tucked into the hills of northern Pennsylvania, about 4 hours from where I lived. I'd never been there, never even heard Howard mention the place before he disappeared from our lives. The lawyer, a gravelly, voiced man named Frederickson, said Howard had been found dead of a heart attack in his study, surrounded by boxes of old newspapers and what looked like research materials. I drove out there that Saturday morning, leaving before dawn to beat the traffic. The GPS led me through winding mountain roads that got narrower the closer I got to Stillwater, until I was following a cracked two-lane that hadn't seen maintenance since the Bush administration. The town itself looked forgotten, a main street with half the shops boarded up, a diner with 3 pickup trucks parked outside, and a gas station where the attendant stared at me like I'd grown a second head when I mentioned Howard's name. The house stood at the edge of town, up a gravel drive lined with overgrown hedges that scraped against my car. It was massive. 3 stories of peeling gray paint and ornate woodwork, with a wraparound porch that sagged in places and windows that reflected the afternoon sun like blank eyes. The key was under a stone frog by the front steps, exactly where Frederickson said it would be. When I pushed open the heavy oak door, the smell hit me immediately. Dustan, old paper, and something else. Something chemical and sharp that made my nose burn. The study was exactly where Frederickson described it. First door on the right past the grand staircase. Howard had transformed it into something between a library and a detective's evidence room. Every wall was covered with corkboards, and every corkboard was covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes connected by different colored strings. Red string for disappearances, blue for property records. green for something labeled Society Activities in Howard's cramped handwriting. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface buried under stacks of yellowed documents and leather journals. I picked up the nearest journal, dated just 3 weeks before Howard died. The first entry made my breath catch. They know I am getting close. Found another pipe in the basement wall today. Behind the wine rack. Same diameter as the others. Whatever they were moving through this house. They needed a network for it. I set the journal down and walked closer to the corkboards, trying to make sense of the chaos. The disappearances went back decades. The oldest clipping was from 1978. About a traveling salesman whose car was found abandoned near the house. Then a hitchhiker in 1983. A runaway teenager in 1991. A homeless veteran in 2006, all last seen within a mile of this property. Howard had marked each one with a red pin on a hand-drawn map of Stillwater, and all the pins formed a rough circle around the Victorian. But it was the photographs that really got to me. Black and white shots from what looked like the 1950s showing groups of men in suits standing in front of the house. Their faces serious and purposeful. One photo had names written on the back in fading ink. The Stillwater Preservation Committee. 1953. I recognized some of the surnames. They matched the businesses in town. The ones that were still open, Brennan Hardware Store, the Garrison Diner. These weren't random historical photos. These were the grandfathers and fathers of people still living in Stillwater. I spent the next 2 hours going through Howard's research. And the picture that emerged made my mouth go dry. The Stillwater Preservation Committee wasn't about preserving the town's history. It was about preserving their secrets. Howard had found property records showing that the Victorian had been purchased by the committee in 1952 but kept in rotating names of individual members to avoid suspicion. They'd meet here monthly, according to Howard's surveillance notes from the past year. He'd photographed license plates, documented arrival times, even recorded snippets of conversation through a device he'd planted near the back entrance. One transcript stood out. The new infrastructure is almost complete. 3 more months, and we can resume operations at full capacity. That was dated just 6 weeks ago. I found myself pacing the room, trying to process what Howard had uncovered. This wasn't some conspiracy theory from a lonely old man. He had receipts, documentation, proof that something organized was happening in this house. The basement door was in the kitchen, painted shut with so many layers that I had to use a knife to break the seal. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, and that chemical smell got stronger with each step down. The basement was massive, running the full length of the house, with stone walls that wept moisture and a concrete floor that looked newer than it should. Howard had been busy down here, too. Chalk marks on the walls, measurements written in white, and in the far corner. The wine rack he'd mentioned pulled away from the wall. Behind it was a hole, maybe 8 inches in diameter, running horizontally into the wall. I got on my knees and shined my phone's flashlight inside. The pipe was PVC, modern, and it branched off in multiple directions like a network of veins. But what really made me pull back was the smell coming from inside, concentrated and medical. Like a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, I stood up and noticed something else. Fresh scratches on the concrete floor leading from the pipe to a drain in the center of the room that looked recently installed. That's when I heard the front door open upstairs. Not a subtle creak, but a confident push like someone with their own key. Footsteps followed, multiple sets, heavy and deliberate. I killed my phone's flashlight and moved behind the furnace, my heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps spread out above me, some heading toward the study, others moving through the house with purpose. Through the floorboards, I heard a woman's voice, clear and authoritative. Check every room. Make sure he didn't leave anything new. The nephew's car is here, so he's probably in town asking questions. A man responded. Garrison already called. Kid stopped at the diner an hour ago, was showing Howard's photo around. My legs felt weak. They'd been watching me since I arrived. The woman spoke again. Good. We'll have maybe 20 minutes before he comes back. Get the remaining documents from the study and check if Howard found the secondary hub in the attic. Secondary hub? There was more than just the basement set up. I waited until the footsteps moved away from the kitchen before creeping back to the stairs. Through a crack in the door, I could see legs passing by, at least 4 people, maybe 5. They moved like they owned the place, which, according to Howard's research, they essentially did. I recognized one voice from the diner that morning. The cook who'd served me coffee and asked if I was just passing through. My phone vibrated in my pocket, making me nearly jump out of my skin. A text from an unknown number. Mr. Beaumont, this is Fredrickson. Please call immediately. Urgent information about your uncle's estate. But Fredrickson had specifically told me he was unreachable on weekends. Gone fishing until Monday. Whoever was upstairs had my phone number. I turned the phone completely off and shoved it deep in my pocket. The basement had another exit. Howard had marked it on one of his hand-drawn floor plans, an old coal chute that led to the side yard. Hidden behind a metal shelf full of paint cans, I started moving toward it, trying to remember the exact location from the diagram. The metal shelf was exactly where Howard had marked it. But moving it quietly was impossible. The moment I touched it, a paint can tumbled, hitting the concrete with a crash that echoed through the basement. The footsteps upstairs stopped immediately. Did you hear that? Someone asked. The woman's voice cut through. He's in the basement. Thompson, Garrison, block the exits. Brennan, with me. The kitchen door flew open, and feet pounded down the stairs. I abandoned stealth and shoved the shelf aside, revealing the coal chute, a narrow metal tunnel angling up toward daylight. I scrambled inside just as flashlights swept the basement behind me. The chute was tighter than it looked, covered in decades of coldest and rust that blackened my clothes and filled my lungs. Halfway up, my shoulders wedged tight. Behind me, someone shouted, "He's in the chute." I heard metal scraping. They were trying to grab my legs. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I had. I twisted, pulled, and scraped my way up until I burst out into daylight, gasping and coughing black dust. The side yard was bordered by thick woods, and I ran straight for them without looking back. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I crashed through the underbrush, following what looked like an old deer trail. Behind me, car doors slammed and engines roared to life. They'd have to take the long way around to reach this part of the woods by vehicle, giving me maybe a 5-minute head start. Howard had been smarter than I'd realized. His journals mentioned multiple cache sites around the property where he'd hidden copies of his research. The closest one was beneath a distinctive rock formation about a quarter-mile into the woods, marked by 3 white blazes on a massive oak tree. I found it after 10 minutes of desperate searching. A waterproof container buried under loose stones, containing flash drives, photocopies, and a prepaid phone with a single number programmed in. The contact was listed as insurance. I called it while moving deeper into the woods, and a young woman answered on the first ring. "Mr. Howard, thank God you are." I cut her off. "Howard's dead. This is his nephew. I have his research. They're after me right now." There was a pause. Then her voice went sharp and professional. "Listen carefully. I am Agent Diane Russo with the D. Howard was helping us build a case. Those pipes you probably found? They're distribution infrastructure for synthetic fentanyl. The Stillwater Preservation Committee has been using that house as a hub for 40 years, first for methamphetamines, now for fentanyl. They process it in the attic, move it through the pipe system to avoid detection, and dispose of evidence through that drainage system. The disappearances Howard tracked. Those were people who got too close to the truth or threatened their operation. We're 40 minutes out with a full tactical team. Can you stay hidden? I told her about my location. And she guided me to a ranger station 2 miles north that had been abandoned for years, but still had a reinforced basement. I made it there just as I heard dogs barking in the distance. They'd brought out trackers. The ranger station was a concrete block building with boards over the windows and a heavy steel door that still locked from the inside. I barricaded myself in the basement and waited, listening to the dogs get closer, then farther, then closer again as they tried to pick up my trail. 37 minutes later, the woods exploded with sirens and helicopter rotors. Through a crack in the boarded window, I watched federal agents in tactical gear swarm the Victorian house and the surrounding area. The committee members who'd been hunting me were arrested on the spot, caught with weapons and evidence they'd removed from Howard's study. Agent Russo found me an hour later after the scene was secure. She told me Howard had contacted them 6 months ago after discovering the drug operation, and he'd been systematically documenting everything to build an airtight case. His heart attack was suspicious, but they couldn't prove murder yet. The house would be seized as evidence, along with 3 other properties in town that served as distribution points. 23 people were arrested that day, including the mayor and the police chief. The Stillwater Preservation Committee had controlled the town for decades, using it as a perfect cover for their operation. Small, isolated, with a population trained not to ask questions. I gave my testimony, handed over Howard's research, and never went back to Stillwater. The government seized the house, and I received a settlement from Howard's actual estate. Mostly his savings and life insurance. It was enough to start over, somewhere far from Pennsylvania. Sometimes I think about those missing people Howard tracked, wonder if they'll ever find them. Russo told me they excavated parts of the property but wouldn't tell me what they found. Some questions are better left unasked. "4 months ago, I inherited a diner from my great-aunt Dolores, someone I'd only met twice in my entire life. The lawyer called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was sitting in my cramped Chicago apartment, scrolling through job listings after another failed interview. He said Dolores had left me her business in Gravelton, Iowa, a town so small it barely showed upon GPS. I remember laughing at first, thinking it was some kind of scam. But the paperwork was legitimate. The Blue Moon Diner, established 1952, complete with all equipment, recipes, and a small apartment above the restaurant. After 6 months of unemployment and dwindling savings, I figured, why not give small town life a shot? The worst that could happen was I'd fail and come back to the city with a story to tell. At least that's what I told myself as I packed my Honda Accord with everything I owned. Gravelton turned out to be one of those towns where Main Street was literally the main street, lined with brick buildings that hadn't changed since the 60s. Population 847. According to the weathered sign at the town limits, the Blue Moon sat right in the middle of downtown, sandwiched between a barber shop and an antique store that looked permanently closed. When I first walked in, with the keys jangling in my hand, the place smelled like old grease and lemon cleaner. That distinctive diner smell that gets into everything. The locals started showing up within minutes of my arrival. Mrs. Holloway from the post office, bringing me a casserole. Tom from the gas station, offering to help fix the broken neon sign, and at least a dozen others who just wanted to welcome the new owner. They were almost aggressively friendly, each one mentioning how glad they were to see the diner opening again, how the town hadn't been the same without it. Their enthusiasm seemed genuine, but there was something in their eyes when they looked at me, a kind of careful watchfulness that made me uncomfortable. The first week was a blur of cleaning, organizing, and trying to make sense of Aunt Dolores's system, she'd kept everything meticulously organized. Inventory lists dating back decades, supplier contacts written in perfect cursive, and a metal lockbox in the office that I couldn't open. The key wasn't with the others the lawyer had given me. I found her recipe collection in a filing cabinet, each one handwritten on index cards yellowed with age. Some dating back to the original owner. There was something oddly specific about the measurements. Not just a pinch of salt, but 3/8 teaspoon precisely, not seasoned to taste, but exact amounts of every spice. The cards were covered in plastic sleeves, protected like precious documents. Mrs. Holloway stopped by every morning for coffee. Always sitting at the counter, always ordering the same thing. She'd watch me work with those sharp blue eyes, occasionally offering advice about suppliers or which customers liked their eggs over easy versus scrambled by the second week. I had the place running smoothly enough to open for breakfast and lunch. The crowd surprised me. Apparently, everyone in Gravelton and the surrounding farms had been waiting for the Blue Moon to reopen. They ordered like they'd been starving 4 months, especially the daily specials that I made from Dolores's recipes. The meatloaf on Mondays, chicken pot pie on Wednesdays, and the famous Blue Moon chili on Fridays that people actually called ahead to reserve. George, who ran the hardware store, told me that chili recipe had been in the diner for 70 years, never changed, never shared. People drove from 3 towns over just for a bowl. I followed those recipe cards religiously, measuring everything exactly as written, and the compliments poured in. Tastes just like Dolores used to make, they'd say, or, haven't had this since the diner closed. The cash register rang constantly, and I started thinking maybe this inheritance was actually a blessing. Everything changed when I found the newspaper clippings. I was cleaning out the basement storage room, trying to make space for new supplies, when I knocked over a box of old promotional materials. Behind it, wrapped in plastic, was a collection of articles from the Gravelton Gazette, dated 1987. Mystery illness strikes 5 at Blue Moon Diner. Read the first headline. Then, police investigate possible poisoning at local restaurant, and Blue Moon temporarily closed as death toll rises to 3. My knees went weak as I read through them. 3 people had died after eating the Friday special, the chili. 2 more were hospitalized 4 weeks. The police investigated 4 months but never found evidence of intentional poisoning. The health department cleared the diner, saying it must have been a contaminated batch of meat or vegetables, but there was one article, smaller than the others, that mentioned how strange it was that only certain customers got sick, all of them newcomers to town. All of them eating alone at the counter. I sat on that cold basement floor for an hour, reading and rereading every article. The diner had reopened just 2 months after the incident, under the same ownership. The town had seemingly forgotten about it, or chosen to. There were photos of the victims, a traveling salesman from Nebraska, a young woman passing through on her way to Minneapolis, and an elderly man who just moved to Gravelton to be closer to his daughter. All strangers, all dead within days of eating at the Blue Moon. The articles mentioned that the recipes were tested extensively, but nothing toxic was found. The ingredients were normal, the preparation standard, yet somehow 3 people had died. I thought about all the meals I'd served in the past 2 weeks, all those recipe cards I'd followed so precisely, and felt sick. When I finally climbed back upstairs, the dinner rush was starting, and through the window, I could see the familiar faces of locals already filling up the booths, chatting and laughing like nothing in the world could be wrong. That night, I couldn't bring myself to cook. I told everyone I was feeling under the weather and closed early. Mrs. Holloway seemed particularly concerned, patting my hand with her weathered fingers and telling me to get some rest. After everyone left, I went straight to the office and tried everything I could think of to open that metal lockbox. Paper clips, screwdrivers, even a hammer from the maintenance closet. Finally, around midnight, I found a small tape to the underside of Dolores's desk drawer. Inside the box were 2 sets of recipe cards, identical to the ones I'd been using except for tiny differences. The chili recipe in the lockbox called for regular paprika, while the one in the filing cabinet specified Hungarian paprika from the Morrison family farm. The meatloaf in the box used standard breadcrumbs. The filed version required breadiums from Thursday's unsold wheatloaf, ground fine. Every single recipe had these small variations. And at the bottom of the locked set was a note in Dolores's handwriting. 4 strangers passing through. The implications hit me like ice water in the veins. 2 sets of recipes, 1 for locals, 1 for strangers. I grabbed my laptop and searched for more information about the 1987 incident. Diving deep into old forums and archived pages, I found a memorial page for one of the victims, Janet Bauer. Created by her sister. She'd written about how Janet was just driving through, had stopped for lunch on recommendation from a gas station attendant. She'd sat at the counter, ordered the special, and was dead 4 days later from what doctors called an unusual toxic reaction. The sister mentioned something that made me stop breathing. Janet had taken photos of her meal, and in one of them, you could see Mrs. Holloway in the background, sitting at her usual spot at the counter, eating the same chili. Perfectly fine. I went back to the kitchen and compared the 2 chili recipes again. The difference was in 3 ingredients. The paprika, a specific type of cumin that had to be locally ground, and something called prairie sage that the regular recipe didn't include at all. The next morning, Friday, I woke up with a decision to make. The breakfast crowd would expect the diner to open at 6, and by noon, people would be calling about the chili. I dressed slowly, my mind racing through the possibilities. Maybe the local ingredients had developed some kind of natural immunity in the townspeople over generations. Maybe it was all coincidence. But I knew better. This was deliberate. The whole town had to know. Mrs. Holloway with her watchful eyes, Tom who'd been so eager to help, George who'd praised the sacred recipes. They were all eating the safe versions while strangers got something else. I thought about calling the police. But what would I say? That I found 2 sets of recipes with slight variations. That people died 37 years ago from food poisoning that was never proven intentional. They'd think I was paranoid. Plus, the local sheriff, Bill Crawford, ate lunch at the diner 3 times a week, always greeting everyone by name. Always knowing who belonged and who didn't. I opened the diner that morning because I needed to understand more. The breakfast rush came and went, locals ordering their usual, chatting about the weather and corn prices. Around 11, I started preparing the chili, using the safe recipe from the filing cabinet. As I stirred the pot, Mrs. Holloway walked in for her pre-lunch coffee. She watched me add the Hungarian paprika, nodding approvingly. Dolores always said the secret was in the details, she said, her voice casual but her eyes sharp. She knew every family in this town, where they grew their herbs, which farms had the best spices. It's what made this place special. Then a man walked in I'd never seen before, pulling off his sunglasses, checking his phone for a signal, out of state plates on his car, California from what I could see. He sat at the counter, exactly where Janet Bauer had sat in that photo, and asked what was good. Mrs. Holloway turned to look at him, then at me. And I swear the temperature in the room dropped. "The chilies are Friday special," she said before I could speak. "Everyone loves the chili." My hand stayed steady as I ladled the chili into a bowl, the safe version I'd been making all morning. I could feel Mrs. Holloway's eyes boring into my back as I set it down in front of the man from California. He took a big spoonful, smiled, and said it was excellent. Mrs. Holloway's coffee cup clinked against her saucer. A sharp sound in the quiet diner. More locals started filing in for lunch, and I noticed how they all glanced at the stranger. Then at me, these quick little assessments that I'd never paid attention to before. George came in and took his regular booth. But instead of his usual friendly wave, he just stared. The man from California finished his chili, left a $20 for a $12 meal, and walked out, alive and healthy. The moment his car pulled away, the atmosphere shifted. Mrs. Holloway stood up, left exact change for her coffee, and walked out without a word. One by one. The other customers followed, leaving their meals half glistetten, filing out in silence until I was alone in the diner that had been packed 5 minutes before. That afternoon, nobody came in. Not for coffee, not for pie, not even to use the bathroom. The phone didn't ring once. As I cleaned the empty tables, I found a note tucked under the register, written in careful cursive. Dolores understood her responsibility. Gravelton takes care of its own. I packed that night, throwing everything into garbage bags and boxes, not caring what got broken. I loaded my car in the dark, knowing they were watching from behind curtains and through cracked doors. The lockbox with the poisoned recipes went with me, evidence maybe, or insurance, I wasn't sure. As I drove out of Gravelton at dawn, passing that population sign one last time, I understood what they hadn't written in those newspaper articles. This wasn't about hatred or violence. It was about preservation. A town of 847 people who'd learned, maybe during some famine or disaster decades ago, that certain local plants processed certain ways created immunity in those who consumed them regularly but were toxic to outsiders. They'd turned survival into tradition, protection into poison, using the diner as their gate, their filter. Their way of keeping Gravelton exactly as it was. I drove straight through to Chicago, only stopping for gas. Never eating at diners, and filed a report with the FBI that probably went nowhere. The Blue Moon is closed now, I heard. Waiting for the next distant relative to inherit it. Someone who might be more understanding of small-town traditions. The drive from Michigan to Arizona was supposed to be our big adventure after college graduation. Just me and my best friend Kelsey. To 23-year-olds with nothing but time in her beat, up Ford Explorer packed with way too many snacks and a carefully curated road trip playlist. We'd been on the road for 3 days when we saw the exit sign for Riverbend, somewhere in the middle of Missouri. Kelsey had read about it in one of those America's Forgotten Towns articles she was always finding online. The article called it a place frozen in time, with this old mill from the 1800s that supposedly still had all the original equipment inside. She practically begged me to make the detour, said it would only add an hour to our trip. I should have paid attention to how the gas station attendant 20 miles back had gone quiet when Kelsey mentioned where we were headed. The town itself looked normal enough at first glance. Maybe 500 people, a single main road with a few shops. A diner with one of those vintage neon signs that probably hadn't been updated since the 60s. But there was something about how empty the streets were for a Saturday afternoon in June. We passed maybe 3 people total on our way through town, and each one of them watched our car like they were memorizing the license plate. The mill was on the far edge of town, past a cluster of houses that all had their curtains drawn despite the beautiful weather. Kelsey was practically bouncing in her seat, going on about the architecture and how these old mills were engineering marvels for their time. The building was massive, built from weathered red brick, with a water wheel that hadn't turned in decades. The no trespassing signs were everywhere, but the fence had so many gaps, it seemed more like a suggestion than an actual barrier. We squeezed through one of the gaps, and I remember the smell hit us immediately, musty and metallic. like old pennies mixed with rotting wood. The main floor was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned mill. Rusted machinery, broken windows letting in shafts of dusty light, graffiti from teenagers who'd probably been using this place as a party spot for years. Kelsey was taking pictures of everything, especially this massive grinding stone that must have weighed several tons. I wandered toward what looked like an old office area in the back corner. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, and when I pushed it open, I found filing cabinets that had been ransacked years ago, papers scattered everywhere. But underneath an overturned desk, partially hidden by decades of dust and debris, I spotted something that made me call Kelsey over immediately: a leather wallet, vintage looking. Maybe from the 70s based on the style. Inside the wallet was a driver's license for someone named Douglas Hartley from Kansas. Expired in 1978. There was still cash in it, $43 in old bills. Family photos of kids who'd be in their 50s or 60s now if their dad ever made it home. Kelsey found another wallet wedged behind the filing cabinet, this one from 1983, belonging to a woman from Oklahoma. Then we found more, a lot more. They were everywhere once we started really looking. Stuffed in drawers, shoved into cracks in the walls, some in a cardboard box behind the machinery. Different decades, different states, but all from people passing through. My chest got tight as we counted them. 37 wallets, 11 purses, over 20 loose 80s. Some were so old the lamination was peeling. Others looked like they could have been dropped yesterday. One military ID from 1969 showed a young guy in uniform who couldn't have been older than 19. Kelsey's face had gone pale, and she kept saying we needed to call the police, that this was evidence of something horrible. I was already pulling out my phone when I realized I had no signal. Not even emergency calls would go through. Kelsey checked hers, too. Same thing. Which was weird because we'd had full bars in town just 20 minutes ago. We decided to document everything first. Take photos of all the IDs, so we'd have proof when we got back to town and could find a phone. While Kelsey was photographing, I noticed something else that made my mouth go dry. Mixed in with all the personal items were sets of car keys, dozens of them. Old Ford keys, Chevy, some with those plastic dealership tags still attached. Rental car fobs from companies that probably didn't even exist anymore. These people hadn't just walked away from their wallets. They'd never made it back to their vehicles. That's when we heard the mill door slam shut. Not the wind. There wasn't any wind that day. The sound echoed through the whole building, deliberate and final. Through the broken windows, I could see someone had wrapped a chain around the door handles from the outside. Then came footsteps, multiple sets, walking around the perimeter of the building. Kelsey grabbed my arm so hard it hurt, and we both crouched behind the machinery, trying to control our breathing. Male voices, at least 3 different ones, casual like they were discussing the weather. One of them mentioned that he'd seen our Explorer parked out front, said it had Michigan plates. Probably worth decent money at the chop shop over in Frankfurt. Another voice, older and gravelly, said something about waiting until dark, that it was cleaner that way. They knew we were in there. They were just deciding what to do with us. The men kept talking, and pieces of their conversation drifted through the broken windows. One mentioned that the sheriff would be at his daughter's recital until evening. Apparently, the sheriff was in on this, too. Another said something about how the last couple who'd come through had a nice BMW. Sold for 15 grand once they stripped it down. They were so matter of fact about it. Like they were discussing farming or fishing, not murder. Kelsey was typing frantically on her phone, trying to get any message out, but nothing would send. I remembered seeing an old loading dock door on the other side of the building when we'd walked around earlier. If we could get there without being seen, maybe we could slip out while they were still at the front. We started crawling, staying low, using the massive machinery as cover. Every sound we made seemed impossibly loud. Our knees on the gritty floor, our breathing. Even our heartbeats felt like they'd give us away. We made it about halfway when I saw him through a gap in the machinery. A man in coveralls standing by what used to be the mill's water intake. He was maybe 50, weathered face, holding a rifle like he'd been born with it. He wasn't looking for us, just standing guard, patient as a statue. Behind him, through another broken window, I could see 2 more men positioned at different corners of the building. They had us surrounded without even trying, like they'd done this before. Knew exactly where people would try to run. Kelsey saw them too, and I watched the hope drain from her face. But then she pointed to something I hadn't noticed, an old grain chute in the floor. Probably used to move product to a lower level. The metal grate covering it was rusted through in places. There was a basement or sublevel. Maybe there was another way out. Something these men didn't know about or had forgotten after all these years. The grate came loose easier than expected. The rust had eaten through most of the bolts. The drop was maybe 8 feet into complete darkness. I went first, landing hard on what felt like packed dirt and old grain that had turned to powder. The smell down there was worse. Stale air that hadn't circulated in decades, mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. Kelsey dropped down behind me, and we used our phone flashlights to look around. The basement was a maze of support pillars and old storage areas. Along one wall were wooden shelves that had mostly collapsed, and scattered on the floor were more personal belongings. Watches, rings, a child's toy bear from who knows how long ago. But what really got me was the scratches on the wooden pillars. Deep gouges at about shoulder height, some with dark stains around them. People had been kept down here. People had tried to claw their way out. Kelsey found the tunnel first, an old drainage pipe, maybe 4 feet in diameter, leading away from the mill toward what we hoped was the river. The metal was corroded but intact, and when we shined our lights down it, we could see it extended beyond the range of the beam. We could hear the men above us now, their footsteps heavy on the old floorboards, calling out that they knew we were there, that we might as well come out and make this easy. One of them must have noticed the open grate because suddenly there was shouting. Angry now instead of casual. We didn't have a choice. We crawled into that pipe, our phones in our mouths for light. Moving as fast as we could through decades of sediment, and God knows what else. The pipe seemed endless, and behind us, echoing in the metal, we could hear them entering the basement. Their voices distorted but getting closer. After what felt like hours but was probably 10 minutes. The pipe opened up into a concrete junction box near the river, about a quarter mile from the mill. We pulled ourselves out. Covered in rust and filth, our hands and knees torn up from the crawl. The sun was starting to set, painting everything orange and red. We ran along the riverbank, staying in the trees, circling back toward town and Kelsey's Explorer. We could see the mill in the distance, see flashlights moving around inside. Searching. When we finally made it to the car, our hands were trembling so bad, Kelsey dropped the keys twice. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, and we drove straight through town, doing 60 on their little main street. Nobody tried to stop us, but I saw curtains moving in windows, faces watching. At the gas station 20 miles out. The same attendant from before was still on shift. When he saw us, covered in dirt and rust, eyes wild with fear, he just nodded slowly and said, "We were lucky." Said most people who stop in Riverbend don't stop anywhere else after that. We drove straight through to Arizona. 15 hours without stopping except for gas. Kelsey wanted to call the FBI, the state police, anybody who would listen. I convinced her to wait until we got somewhere safe. In Phoenix, we filed reports with everyone we could think of. We had the photos of all those IDs, descriptions of the men, everything. The FBI agent who interviewed us seemed interested at first, but after he made some calls, his whole demeanor changed. He said they'd look into it, but that sometimes old mills collect debris over the years, that people lose things. That we were probably just spooked by some locals pulling a prank. 2 weeks later, Kelsey got a call saying our report had been closed due to lack of evidence. When we checked online, every photo we'd taken in that mill was corrupted, showing nothing but black screens. Riverbend doesn't show up on Google Maps anymore. The exit we took is just empty highway now, according to the navigation. But I know it's still there, that little town with its covered up secrets. Waiting for the next car without of state plates to pull off the interstate. Curious about a forgotten piece of America. The morning I drove into Black Hollow, West Virginia. I was 32 years old and had exactly $800 left in my checking account. 2 weeks earlier, the marketing firm where I'd worked for 7 years had let go of half their staff, including me. And my severance barely covered what I owed on credit cards. A friend from college mentioned she knew someone renting out a cabin dirt cheap in the Appalachians. Only $100 a month if I paid 3 months up front. The photos showed a simple wooden structure surrounded by pine trees, with a stone fireplace and basic furniture. Perfect for someone who needed to disappear for a while and figure out their next move. The GPS lost signal about 20 miles before I reached the turnoff. And I had to follow handwritten directions the owner had texted me, counting mailboxes and looking for a rusted green water tower. The first person I encountered was at the only gas station in town. A cramped building with wood paneling that looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. The attendant, a woman probably in her 60s with gray hair pulled back tight, watched me pump gas through the window. When I went inside to pay, she studied my face while running my card. Then asked if I was heading up to the Garrett place. That's what she called it, not a cabin or rental. But the Garrett place. I nodded, and she exchanged a look with an older man buying cigarettes. Just a quick glance that lasted maybe half a second. She handed back my card without saying anything else. But the man followed me outside and stood by his truck, pretending to check his phone while obviously watching me load my groceries. His truck had a faded sticker on the back window, some kind of eagle holding arrows, and below it, text I couldn't quite make out. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that wound through dense forest for about 3 miles. Every 100 yards or so, I noticed these orange paint marks on trees, always 3 diagonal slashes. Always on the right side of the road. The rental listing hadn't mentioned neighbors, but I passed driveways with heavy chains across them, and no trespassing signs that looked handmade. With additional warning spray painted on plywood, one said. "We don't call 911," with a crude drawing of a rifle underneath. The key was hidden under a fake rock near the front door, just like the owner promised, though I noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud that weren't from my car. Inside, the cabin was clean but had this strange smell, like copper pennies mixed with pine cleaner. The furniture was older than the photos suggested, and in the bedroom closet, someone had left behind a cardboard box filled with what looked like military surplus items, ammunition boxes, canvas bags with weird insignia, and a stack of photocopied papers I didn't look through. The isolation hit me that first night when I realized I couldn't hear anything except wind through trees. No cars, no distant neighbors, no planes overhead. Around 9 o'clock, while I was reading on the couch, I heard footsteps on the wooden porch, slow and deliberate. Through the front window, I saw a man standing there, not knocking. Just standing with his hands in his pockets facing the door. He was maybe 50, wearing a baseball cap and work clothes. Completely still, like he was waiting for something. I didn't move, didn't turn on more lights. Just watched him through a gap in the curtains. After about 5 minutes, he walked back down the steps and disappeared into the darkness. I couldn't see a vehicle anywhere, which meant he'd walked through the woods to get here. I pushed a chair against the front door that night, telling myself I was being paranoid, that maybe he was just checking on the property for the owner. The next morning, I found boot prints circling the entire cabin, going right up to each window. Some stopped under the bathroom window, the prints deeper there like someone had stood in that spot for a while. On the back door, someone had drawn 3 diagonal lines in the dirt, matching those orange marks on the trees. I tried calling the owner but got voicemail. So I drove back to town for cell service and to feel less isolated, at a small diner on the main road. I sat at the counter and ordered coffee. The waitress, a younger woman with blonde hair and tired eyes, leaned close when she poured and whispered that I should leave. Just that, nothing else. "You should leave." Then she walked away like nothing happened. When I tried to pay, she wouldn't look at me, and I noticed her hands trembling as she made change. The cook in the back, visible through the service window, kept staring at me with this flat expression, not hostile exactly, but like he was memorizing my face. On my way back to the cabin, a pickup truck followed me from town, staying about 50 feet behind, matching my speed exactly. It wasn't the same truck from the gas station. This one was newer, dark blue with tinted windows. At the turnoff to the cabin's dirt road, I stopped, and the truck stopped, too, just sitting there with the engine running. We stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds before I turned and the truck continued straight, but slow. So slow it couldn't have been going more than 10 miles per hour. When I got back, the cardboard box from the closet was now on the kitchen table, the papers spread out like someone had been reading them. They were meeting minutes from something called the Black Hollow Resistance Committee, dated from the early 2000s, talking about defending the homeland and maintaining operational security. One page had a list of names with addresses, and at the bottom, someone had recently written in pen, "She's here." My first instinct was to pack everything and leave immediately, but when I went outside, my car wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't even turn over, just clicked when I turned the key. The hood was still locked, no visible damage. But someone had clearly done something to it while I was reading those papers. No cell service meant I couldn't call for help, and walking back to town would take hours through those woods, past those driveways with chains and warnings. I went back inside and started packing anyway, throwing clothes into my bag while trying to think clearly. That's when I heard vehicles approaching. Multiple engines growing louder up the dirt road. Through the bedroom window, I watched 3 trucks pull up and park in a semicircle around my dead car. About 8 men got out, all wearing regular clothes, but moving in this coordinated way, spreading out to cover different angles of the cabin. One of them was the man from last night, and he was carrying a rifle, not pointing it, just holding it casually across his chest. They didn't storm in or yell demands. They just waited. One man, older than the others with a white beard and sunburned face, walked up to the porch and knocked politely, like he was delivering a package. When I didn't answer, he called out that they needed to talk about my situation and that I'd found property that didn't belong to me. His voice was calm, almost friendly, but the way he said property made it clear he wasn't talking about the cabin. Through the kitchen window, I could see 2 more men positioned near the tree line, watching the back of the house. The bearded man kept talking, explaining that Black Hollow folks took care of their own problems, that they'd protected this place for 20 years from outsiders who wouldn't understand their way of life. He said the owner, Mr. Garrett, should never have rented to strangers, that it was a mistake they now had to correct. He gave me 10 minutes to come out and discuss things like civilized people, then walked back to lean against one of the trucks. Checking his watch, I remembered something from those papers. A hand-drawn map showing various locations marked with X's, and one marked emergency cache near a creek about a quarter-mile behind the cabin. If these people had hidden supplies, maybe there was something I could use, maybe even a radio or flare gun. The bathroom had a small window facing the woods, barely big enough to squeeze through. I turned on the kitchen faucet and the television to create noise, then locked myself in the bathroom and pried open the window screen. The men out front were focused on the main entrance, and the two watching the back were positioned more to the sides. I dropped my bag out first, then pulled myself through, scraping my ribs on the frame. The woods were thick enough that once I got 20 feet from the cabin, I was hidden. Behind me, I could hear the bearded man call out that I had 5 minutes left. His voice still patient, but with an edge now. The creek was exactly where the map indicated. Running shallow over moss-covered rocks, I followed it downstream, looking for anything unusual, and found a green metal box partially buried under exposed tree roots. Inside were vacuum-sealed bags containing cash. About $3,000 in small bills, to prepaid cell phones still in plastic, car keys, and a loaded handgun I didn't touch. There was also a notebook wrapped in plastic with more names, photos of people at what looked like training exercises, and detailed plans for something called Day Zero. The phones were old, but when I powered one on, it had a single bar of service. I called 911 and told them I was being held against my will by armed men at the Garrett cabin in Black Hollow. The dispatcher went quiet for a long moment, then said they'd send someone, but it would take time. Maybe an hour since they had to call in state police. She told me to stay hidden and keep the line open, but I could hear hesitation in her voice, like she knew exactly what I was talking about and wasn't sure what would happen when help arrived. I heard shouting from the direction of the cabin, then the sound of breaking glass. They'd discovered I was gone. The beardhead man's voice carried through the trees, no longer friendly, barking orders to search the perimeter and check the creek. I grabbed the money and one phone, leaving everything else, and moved deeper into the woods, trying to remember which direction led to the main road. Tree branches kept catching my clothes, and every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. About 15 minutes into moving through the underbrush, I heard dogs barking, getting closer. These people knew the land, had dogs, and were organized, like they'd done this before. I found a cluster of fallen trees creating a small hollow covered by dead leaves and wedged myself inside, pulling branches over the opening. The barking got louder, maybe 2 or 3 dogs, and I could hear men calling to each other, coordinating their search pattern. One voice passed so close I could hear his breathing, heavy from running, and the static of a walkie-talkie saying they found my tracks heading toward the creek. 40 minutes passed like hours lying in that hollow, insects crawling across my face, trying not to move or breathe too loud. Then I heard sirens, multiple vehicles, and the dogs suddenly stopped barking. Through the leaves, I glimpsed flashlight beams swinging wildly as the searchers headed back toward the cabin. The state police dispatcher called the phone, asking for my exact location, and when I whispered where I was, she said to stay put, that officers were securing the scene. It took another 20 minutes before a female officer found me, her hand on her weapon, looking as nervous as I felt. She helped me out and walked me to a state police cruiser. Past federal-looking vehicles I hadn't heard arrive, the cabin area was flooded with law enforcement, and I saw the bearded man in handcuffs, but most of the trucks were gone, and only 3 other men were detained. The officer told me they'd been watching this group for years, but never had someone willing to come forward. That the cabin was supposed to be off limits, but Garrett rented it out without the others knowing, probably needing money. She said I was lucky I called when I did. They drove me to a motel 2 counties over and had me give statements for 3 days. The FBI showed me photos of weapons caches they found, training sites, and plans for attacks on federal buildings. I never went back for my car or belongings. They said the group had scattered but would reform somewhere else. That groups like this were all over these mountains, waiting. I still have one of those prepaid phones and the money. Evidence they said I could keep since it couldn't be traced. Sometimes I check online for news about Black Hollow. But here is never anything, like the whole thing never happened. I never thought I'd write about what happened last August. But I need to get this out there because maybe someone can explain what I stumbled into. I was living in Austin at the time. Had been there for almost 15 years working as an electrical contractor. Decent life, nothing spectacular, but comfortable enough. I left my hometown in Kentucky when I was 22, right after my parents died in that car accident on Route 60, and honestly, never planned on going back. The place held too many memories. You know how small towns can suffocate you with their weight of history and everyone knowing your business. That Wednesday started like any other. Coffee, checking work orders, planning to rewire some guy's garage. Until my phone rang around noon with a number I didn't recognize, area code from back home. The voice on the other end was raspy, like someone who'd been smoking for decades, and they knew my full name, middle name included, which immediately set off alarm bells in my head. They said they'd been trying to find me for months. That there was something in my parents' old house I needed to see, something about answers to questions I didn't even know I had. When I asked who they were, the line went quiet for maybe 10 seconds before they said, "Someone who knew your father better than you think," and hung up. I tried calling back, but the number was dead. Like it never existed. I spent the rest of that day distracted, couldn't focus on work. Kept thinking about that voice and what could possibly be waiting in a house that had been empty for 15 years. By evening, I'd packed a bag and was on the road, telling myself I was just going to drive by, maybe peek through the windows, nothing more. The drive took me through the night and into the next morning. 18 hours of highways gradually narrowing into those winding mountain roads I used to know like the back of my hand. The closer I got, the more wrong everything felt, not scary exactly. Just like driving into an old photograph where the colors had started to fade. When I finally hit the town limits around 10 in the morning, the first thing I noticed was how empty everything was. Not abandoned like a ghost town in the movies, but more like everyone had just stepped out for a minute and never came back. Cars were still parked in driveways but covered in pollen and leaves. Mailboxes were stuffed so full that envelopes were scattered on the ground below them. The grocery store where Mrs. Coleman used to give me free candy was still there, lights on inside. But when I walked up to the glass doors, I could see rows of expired products on the shelves and a thick layer of dust on everything I drove through what used to be downtown. Past the barber shop where my dad got his hair cut every third Saturday, past the church where half the town showed up every Sunday, and maybe saw 3 people total. An old woman sweeping her porch who went inside the second she saw my truck. A guy in overalls who literally turned and walked the other direction when I waved. And someone watching me from behind curtains in a second-story window. I could see their silhouette. But they backed away when they realized I'd spotted them. The weird part was that some houses looked lived in fresh paint. Mowed lawns, flowers in the window boxes, while others right next door were clearly abandoned. With broken windows and yards gone wild, there was no pattern to it. Like someone had randomly decided which houses to maintain and which to let rot. The silence was the worst part, though. No dogs barking, no lawnmowers running, no kids playing. Just this heavy quiet that made my ears ring. My parents' house sat at the end of Sycamore Drive. A white two-story with green shutters that I'd helped my dad paint the summer before I left. From the street, it looked exactly the same. Like I could walk in and find my mom making her famous pit roast, while Dad watched the game in his recliner. The lawn was perfect. not a blade out of place. The flower beds my mother loved still bloomed with those purple petunias she ordered from some catalog every spring. Even the mailbox had been repainted recently, our last name, Caldwell, still stenciled on the side in that fancy script my mom picked out. But when I got closer, I noticed things that didn't add up. The doormat was new, one of those modern rubber ones. Not the woven, welcome mat my mom had for 20 years. And there were security cameras mounted under the eaves. Small black domes that definitely weren't there when this was home. The front door was unlocked, which should have been my first red flag to leave. But I was already too deep into this to turn back. The inside hit me with this smell of vanilla air freshener trying to cover something else. Something chemical and sharp, like a hospital corridor. All our old furniture was gone, replaced with metal filing cabinets lining the walls of what used to be our living room. Each one labeled with years ranging from 1985 to 2018. The dining room table where we ate Sunday dinners was now covered in manila folders, spread out like someone had been sorting through them recently. I could see rings from coffee cups, still wet on some of the papers, but what really made me stop breathing for a second was the wall of photographs in the hallway. Dozens of them, all children between maybe 6 and 12 years old. School photos mostly. Some candids at playgrounds or birthday parties, and I recognized at least half of them. Kids from town. Kids I went to school with, kids who supposedly moved away with their families over the years. Under each photo was a label with a name, a date, and a case number written in neat handwriting. Tommy Brennan was up there. Disappeared in 1987, according to the label, but I remembered his parents telling everyone they'd moved to Florida for his dad's new job. Lisa Garrett, 1991. Her family supposedly went to live with relatives in Texas after their farm went under. Kevin Walsh, 1994. His mom said they were starting fresh in Oregon after the divorce. All these kids whose families just vanished overnight. And we all just accepted it because that's what happens in small towns. People leave for better opportunities, right? The dates went all the way up to 2018, kids I didn't recognize. Must have been born after I left town. I pulled out my phone to take pictures but had no signal, not even emergency calls. Which was impossible because I'd had 3 bars when I parked outside. I started opening the folders on the dining table and found police reports that were never filed, witness statements that were never taken, medical examiner notes about remains found in various locations around the county, all stamped with "investigation suspended" in red ink. My dad's name was all over these documents, not as an investigator but as someone who'd been filing complaints, demanding investigations, writing letter after letter to state police, the FBI, anyone who would listen. The dates started about 2 years before he died. Hundreds of pages of his handwriting documenting suspicious disappearances, noting patterns, begging for help. One letter, dated a week before the accident, said, "They're not just taking them anymore. They're replacing families. Bringing in people who look enough like them that nobody asks questions. Check the dental records, check the birth certificates. These aren't the same people." There were responses, too, on official letterhead, telling him to stop wasting resources, threatening legal action if he continued his harassment. And one final notice, dated the day before my parents died, that said, "Your concerns have been noted and no further action will be taken. Consider this matter closed." I was reading through his notes about how certain town officials seemed to know when kids would disappear when I heard footsteps on the porch. 3 people walked in without knocking, 2 men in their 50s and a younger woman, all wearing regular clothes but moving like cops, that careful way of keeping their hands visible but ready. The older guy, gray beard and work boots, looked familiar. But I couldn't place him until he smiled, and I saw he was missing the same front tooth as Sheriff Coleman, who used to run the town back when I was a kid. Except Sheriff Coleman would be 90 by now if he was still alive. And this guy looked exactly like he did 20 years ago. The woman had a clipboard and started checking things off, while the other man, tall with a scar across his neck, stood by the door like he was blocking it. "You got the call then?" the Coleman lookalike said. Not a question but a statement. "We've been maintaining your father's work, keeping the records safe, waiting for someone from the family to come back. The others said you wouldn't, but I knew you would. You are just like him. Can't leave well enough alone." The woman looked up from her clipboard and spoke in this flat voice, like she was reading a weather report. "Population management protocol has been in effect since 1985. Selected youth are relocated for processing while family units are replaced with compliant alternatives to maintain social stability. Your father's interference resulted in termination, but his documentation was preserved as per regulations. You've now been briefed and have two options: integration or relocation." The tall man by the door pulled out a folder from inside his jacket, opened it to show a photo of me taken that morning at the grocery store, already added to their collection with a case number and everything. The Coleman lookalike kept talking while I tried to process what I was hearing. "We tried to keep you away, let you live your life in Austin, but someone made that phone call against protocol. Now you are here. You've seen the files, and decisions have to be made. The town needs people who understand the situation, who can help maintain things. Your house is still here, we've kept it ready. You could slide right back in like you never left." I asked them what happened to the kids, where they actually went. And the woman tilted her head like I'd asked something strange. "Processing centers in multiple states. Some integrate into new communities under different identities. Others serve different purposes based on aptitude testing. The program has a 94% success rate for social reintegration. Your hometown serves as one of 12 collection points in this region." She pulled out a contract from her clipboard, placed it on the table next to my father's letters. "Sign this, accept your role as a record keeper like your father should have. And you can even continue his documentation work officially this time. Refuse, and you become a relocation case yourself. The choice is yours, but it needs to be made now." The tall man moved away from the door, pulled out a chair for me to sit. And I realized they were completely serious. This wasn't some elaborate prank or delusion. This was real and happening, and had been happening for decades while everyone just looked the other way or got replaced when they asked too many questions. I signed the papers. What else could I do? They had my photo in their files, knew where I lived in Austin, had been watching me for who knows how long. The Coleman lookalike patted my shoulder like we were old friends and told me I'd made the smart choice. That my father would have been proud. I chose to survive rather than fight a system bigger than any of us. They gave me a set of keys, told me someone would come by every month to collect new documentation and bring supplies. And that my job was simple: maintain the records, keep the house ready for viewing when necessary. And never speak about this to anyone outside the network. They left me there with boxes of files dating back 40 years. Hundreds of missing children who were never really missing. Just redistributed like resources in some massive program I still don't fully understand. I drove back to Austin that night, quit my job over the phone, and returned to that house permanently 2 weeks later. That was 3 months ago. And I've been maintaining the records ever since, adding new photos to the wall when they arrive in unmarked envelopes. Filing reports I know no one will ever investigate. The reason I am writing this now, posting it here where maybe someone will see it, is because yesterday I got a new envelope with photos of 3 kids from a town in Ohio I've never heard of. And one of them looks exactly like my nephew, my sister's kid who lives in Seattle. Except the date on the photo is from next month. I called my sister last night, and she said they're planning a family road trip through the Midwest in 2 weeks. mentioned they might stop in some small towns along the way to see real America. I tried to warn her. Told her to stay on the highways, skip the small towns. But she just laughed and said I was being paranoid. I can't leave this house. They track my phone, my car. Are probably reading this right now as I type it. But maybe someone out there will understand what I am trying to say. If your kid's friends suddenly move away without saying goodbye. If families in your town disappear overnight and nobody seems concerned. If you notice people who look familiar, but something about them is just wrong, don't investigate. Don't ask questions. Just leave. Pack up and get out before you get a phone call asking you to come home, before you find yourself sitting where I am. Organizing files for children who'll never be seen again. Becoming part of a machine that's been running longer than any of us realized and will keep running long after we're gone. When I signed the papers for the house on Willow Creek Lane, I told myself it was the kind of place where a second chance could finally take root. 2 stories, pale siding chipped in a way that gave it character, and a narrow porch that creaked every time I shifted my weight. The price was shockingly low, which I chalked up to the market, and the fact that small towns rarely attracted newcomers. After the divorce, I needed a place that felt like mine, quiet, detached from the life I had just left behind. From the outside, the house looked tired but harmless. Like it had been waiting for someone who might care enough to settle in again. My first week was spent trying to make it feel lived in. I painted the kitchen a soft green, unpacked boxes at night while the radio hummed, and left the windows open to let the smell of fresh air replace the scent of dust. Neighbors passed by, some nodding politely, others keeping their gaze locked on the sidewalk. I assumed it was just the small-town way of treating strangers. Still, the silence had an edge to it, as if people were holding back words they didn't want to share. No one lingered long when I tried to strike up a conversation about the weather or the best place to get groceries. One afternoon, while sipping coffee at the only cafe in town, I mentioned the address to the barista, just in passing. The way people do when they're hoping for a bit of local advice about plumbing or lawn care. Her expression faltered for the briefest second, and she fumbled with the lid she was screwing onto my cup. "Willow Creek," she repeated, almost under her breath. Then she forced a smile, too quick, and said, "Hope it works out for you," before moving on to the next customer. It was a small moment, but it stuck with me like a splinter. Curiosity got the better of me a few days later. I drove to the town clerk's office, which was tucked inside a brick building that smelled faintly of mildew and old books. I asked if I could see the property records for my address, pretending it was about taxes. The clerk, a woman with gray hair pinned into a severe bun, gave me a long look before sliding the files across the counter. Page after page detailed previous owners, always women, and next to each name were abrupt endings. Missing, relocated suddenly. Domestic disturbance. It wasn't the kind of neat turnover you'd expect for a modest family home. Reading it felt like pulling back wallpaper, only to discover mold creeping across every inch beneath driving back that evening. The streets of Willow Creek felt narrower than usual, as if the houses leaned in to watch me pass. At home, I sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread in front of me. Each woman's name carried the weight of a story cut short. One had disappeared after only 6 months. Another left suddenly, her belongings still listed in the inventory as unclaimed. And then there was a note about a police call, unresolved disturbance, but no follow-up details. It wasn't just unsettling. It felt like the house itself had a history it was unwilling to release in full. That night, while brushing my teeth upstairs, I heard a soft scrape beneath the floorboards in the hallway. At first, I thought it might be the old house settling. But the noise repeated, slow and deliberate, as though someone were dragging a piece of furniture across bare wood. I stepped into the hallway, toothbrush still in hand, and the sound stopped instantly. The silence afterward was sharp, almost staged, like whoever or whatever had been making it wanted me to know I was being listened to. The following morning, I checked the crawl space in the basement, shining a flashlight into corners heavy with cobwebs. Nothing. No signs of rodents. No shifted boards. No evidence of anything that could have caused that dragging sound. I told myself exhaustion was twisting ordinary noises into something more sinister. Still, when I stood at the kitchen sink later that day, I kept catching my reflection in the window. The odd part was, I could swear the reflection wasn't perfectly in sync. My hand would move a beat faster than the image. Or the tilt of my head lingered in the glass when I'd already straightened later in the week. I mentioned the house again to a woman stocking shelves at the grocery store. She was maybe in her late 50s, with short hair dyed a stubborn red. Her eyes softened when she heard the address, but instead of answering, she quietly shook her head and muttered, "You should have asked before buying." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press her. The way her face tightened around the words told me she'd already said more than she meant to. Walking back to my car, the grocery bags rustling in my hands, I had the strong impression that the house wasn't just avoided. It was actively feared. By the second week, sleep came in short bursts. I'd wake to the sound of faint footsteps pacing across the upstairs landing, always stopping right outside my bedroom door. Each time, I'd sit up, heart hammering, whispering into the darkness just to prove I still had a voice. Nothing answered. But the air in the room always felt heavier afterward, as if someone had been standing on the other side of the wood, deciding whether to enter. One night, I finally worked up the courage to press my ear against the door when the steps began. The boards creaked softly, slow and measured, and then silence. I waited, holding my breath until I heard the faintest whisper. Not words, not even a tone I could place, just the sound of someone breathing steadily inches away. Separated from me only by a thin panel of wood, I slammed my fist against the door, and the breathing stopped, followed by retreating steps that melted into nothing. The next morning, I packed a bag and went back to the clerk's office. I asked directly if anything had ever been found, any trace of the women listed in those files. The clerk didn't answer right away. Instead, she slid the folder back across the counter and murmured, "You'll leave soon, too?" "Everyone does." Her voice wasn't cruel, but it carried the weight of certainty. Like she'd seen the pattern enough times not to doubt it. That evening, I called a realtor and put the house back on the market. I left most of my belongings behind. Even now, I can't explain why. Walking away felt less like running and more like survival. I've rented apartments since, nothing permanent, but safe enough to sleep through the night. Sometimes, when I hear footsteps in the hallway of a new place, I still expect them to stop right outside my door, and every time, I wonder if the house on Willow Creek is still waiting for another woman to sign her name on the deed. I had just come out of a messy breakup that left me feeling like I had no ground beneath me. My apartment felt hollow, my routine stale, and every corner of the city carried some trace of her favorite coffee shop, the bookstore we used to wander, even the damn laundromat. When a rental listing popped up online for a little place in a town I'd never heard of, tucked away in New England, it felt like a lifeline. The ad promised quiet streets, welcoming neighbors, and a library that looked like something out of an old postcard. I didn't even think twice. I packed what I had left and signed the lease. The town was called Whispering Pines, and from the moment I drove in, I noticed how neat everything looked, like it had been arranged for a magazine cover. White porches with rocking chairs, picket fences painted freshly, every mailbox with names carefully stenciled. People waved to me as if I had lived there all my life, and for a second, it was comforting. After weeks of chaos, The rehearsed politeness was a shock to my system. They asked where I came from, but when I answered, they never seemed interested in the details, just smiled and nodded like they already knew more than I was saying. At first, I chalked up the strangeness to small-town quirks. The kind of surface charm you expect when everyone knows each other's grandparents. But after a few days, I started noticing something that didn't sit right. There was no movement, literally none. No moving trucks, no for sale signs. No kids talking about college plans. The local diner had the same crowd every morning, and even though people welcomed me warmly, their conversations carried this subtle undertone that made me feel less like a neighbor and more like a guest at a party I couldn't leave. The library became my refuge. It smelled like dust and lemon polish, its shelves crowded with titles that seemed decades old. The upstairs section was quieter. Almost too quiet, with these long oak tables where the sunlight fell in dusty streaks. One afternoon, while pulling a book on regional history, I noticed something wedged between the stacks, thin, leather-bound journals with dates smudged on the covers. They didn't look like they belonged to the library. The handwriting inside was uneven, shaky, like someone desperate to get their words out before they were cut short. And the names, they weren't locals. They were outsiders, people like me, writing about how they came here and how something was wrong. The first journal I read was from someone named Emily Kerr. She wrote about moving into Whispering Pines after a divorce, about how the townspeople treated her with endless kindness until she realized no one ever left. Her entries grew more frantic. The last one barely legible. They smile, but they're waiting. I hear them outside at night. The hairs on my neck rose as I flipped through. There were other journals, too. Dozens. Each one from someone different, all describing the same slow realization. The town didn't just welcome you, it consumed you. I carried one of the journals home, hidden under my jacket, and read it late into the night. My lamp flickered as if the bulb was about to burn out, and I kept glancing toward the curtains, convinced someone was out there. The writer mentioned being invited to endless community events, potlucks, church services, book clubs, how refusing wasn't an option. The entries described a sense of being monitored, every step noticed. The scariest part wasn't the paranoia, it was how normal everyone acted while the person writing was unraveling. After that night, I started paying closer attention. Mrs. Larkin, my landlord, always showed up unannounced with baskets of bread or peas, her eyes never blinking enough, like she was waiting for me to slip. The man who ran the gas station asked me the same questions every time, word forward, like he was reading from a script. I'd walk down the street and feel heads turn toward me, then quickly away when I caught them. The town had this way of smothering you with kindness that felt less like generosity and more like a net tightening one afternoon. I went back to the library and found the section where I had discovered the journals sealed off with a staff-only sign that hadn't been there before. The librarian, a tall man with graying hair, noticed me lingering and gave me this long stare that made my throat dry up. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. "You've found enough to settle in. Best to stop digging." It didn't sound like advice. It sounded like a warning. That night, I decided to test something. I packed a small duffel bag, nothing that would scream. I am leaving for good, just a change of clothes and some cash. Around midnight, I got in my car and started driving toward the highway. The streets were too quiet, no porch lights, no crickets. Just silence pressing against the windows. When I reached the town's exit sign, there were cones blocking the road. And beyond them, 2 trucks parked sideways, headlights pointed right at me. I didn't see drivers, but I felt eyes on me all the same. I turned around before anyone had to say a word. The next morning, people acted like nothing had happened. Mrs. Larkin waved from her porch with another basket of bread. The gas station man repeated his lines like clockwork. It was as if the night before hadn't existed. Like the town was daring me to mention it. I didn't. Instead, I went back to the library and slipped the journal I'd borrowed under my jacket again, clutching it like proof I wasn't imagining everything. I stayed in Whispering Pines for 3 more weeks, each day heavier than the last. Invitations kept coming, neighbors knocking at my door, all smiles, all insistence. I stopped sleeping properly, jumped at every sound. One evening, I noticed the journal was gone from my nightstand. In its place was a handwritten note on thick paper. "You belong here now. Don't make this harder." That was when I knew I couldn't wait any longer. 2 days later, I left before dawn, abandoning most of my belongings. I drove straight through until the gas tank was nearly dry, only stopping when I crossed into a different state. I never went back for my things, never checked if anyone rented my old place. To this day, I don't know how Whispering Pines manages to keep people there, or why they need outsiders so badly. All I know is that I escaped, and I never talk about that town in person. Writing it here feels dangerous enough,